The short answer is she didn't say anything. And so she, essentially what we call took the fifth, which means she expressed her right to remain silent. For the Fifth Amendment allows you to not, you don't have to answer if it could potentially be self-incriminating. And so she exercised that right. And it happens all the time when someone's in a sticky situation, and especially if it could be self-incriminating and making her case even worse. So what you would rather do is is cut a deal with the prosecutor and say, okay, I'll tell you whatever I want, whatever you want, and I'll be super honest, even if it's information that could make me look worse, but I'll give you some other people. And that way, it's just a bit of horse trading. The time to do that is before the trial, when you still have some leverage. She could have given some information that would have led to some other indictments. But now, after 3 million pages plus of the so-called Epstein files, there's not really anything in there that's indictable. And that's why they didn't want to release the files in the first place, both parties that were in control. And so, I'm not sure there's a lot of bargaining power now. Now, if there is something that she can tell the prosecutors or the courts that does lead to some other indictments, then okay, that's fine. But right now, it appears that all she has is information that will vindicate or totally clear the president, and as well as former President Clinton. And that's not really enough to grant immunity or to grant a pardon. The critics on the right, the critics in the sort of the MAGA circles, they just wanted the information. They wanted the files released. So given that was the real focus, in fact, one of the reasons they wanted the files released was so that they could, that President Trump would be clear and off the hook, instead of all these people speculating that there was damaging information about the president, which there is none. And so I think that was a lot of drama that was probably unnecessary. But so I don't think he'd lose support on the right, but I still think it would just give the Democrats a pile of information and campaign content, saying that he commuted the sentence of a convicted sex trafficker. I mean, I just don't think that sells well. The only way I think he could possibly do it, and the only reason he would do it, is if there was actual credible information where others could be indicted. But again, that the time to do that was in 2022 when she was on trial and could have maybe struck a bargain. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer. Maybe she didn't think it was the right gamble at the time. Maybe she thought she could go to trial and actually be be found not guilty. As it turns out, she was wrong. And so maybe it's time to go back and try plan B. I can only really speak for President Trump because his case is really clear. He stopped hanging around with Epstein in 2003 or 2004, long before he was indicted and convicted of trafficking or whatever the specific charge was. And so it's the people, and I honestly don't remember when Bill Clinton stopped his relationship or terminated his relationship with Epstein. But my guess is it was once Epstein was in trouble, I think the smart ones stopped communicating with him. And so I would imagine Bill Clinton is in that category. But Bill Clinton's got a little more exposure because there's photographs of him in a hot tub, whereas all of the president's photographs are pre-2004, and in many he's with his wife. They're all very polite, respectable photographs. Whereas the hot tub one is always, that's kind of a more of a dodgy picture. It doesn't mean it's illegal and it's not criminal, but it's still a little dodgy. So I think Bill Clinton has more downside than President Trump. I'm just not sure that the president would risk the political capital and give her, whether it's a pardon or commute her sentence. He'd take a lot of heat for that just to clear his name, which basically has been cleared already. And that's, again, why I don't think she has much leverage. She's already said in prior statements that he was a total gentleman, I think is the word she used. If there was anything negative about President Trump, surely the Democrats would have released that in the fall of 2024. So, that's you don't really need to know much else except that, after two federal indictments and the White House colluding with state prosecutors for an additional two indictments at the state level, they were doing anything they possibly could to ruin this president. There's no way they would sit on evidence in the Epstein files that could have not only indicted President Trump or just damaged President Trump. There's no way they would have sat on that. There is nothing on President Trump, and the only reason the left has been pushing this whole argument or narrative is that they were trying to create this theory or some this, I wouldn't call it a conspiracy theory, but they were just trying to create this narrative that there was something bad about President Trump in there and that he was trying to hide it, which is completely obscene. Because as I said before, if they had it, if there was anything in those files, I guarantee you they would have been leaked or released formally in the fall of 24 during the campaign. So yeah, I think he's right. I'm not saying that the president and the campaign have been perfect. They made the mistake of kind of ginning up a lot of this argument and saying during the campaign that the Democrats were sitting on the information and that they weren't releasing it because A, it would vindicate President Trump, which is true, and B, it would, they were arguing that, oh, they're burying it because of Bill Clinton and Bill Gates and Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, all these Democrats that have, been much, if you look at it, most, I don't know what the percentage is, but a great majority of the connections to Epstein were Democrats and very few were Republicans. And in fact, President Trump wasn't even a Republican at the time. And so I think there was some mistakes made, though, because I think the campaign overdid it. They made it sound like, this was some great, public document. And the only guy who really looks good here is there was a congressman, I think from Louisiana, I can't remember his name, and he was the only one to vote against releasing the files because we have 250 years of precedent that says don't release information if it doesn't have anything to do with a criminal indictment. Because most of the information that's released is just information from the investigators that has no credibility or lacked credibility. I think that it would have been wise to keep the information private because none of it had to do with indictments or the criminal trials. It was all just noise from the investigators. And again, I'm not blaming the Democrats for that because the Republicans did the same thing. They made a big deal out of this and said, you must release the files. And that it's rare to never that the prosecutors would release that kind of information. It's just irrelevant. But we sort of dug our own ditch on this one.